This is the incredible true story of Taca Flight 110. A flight that should have ended in total disaster, but instead became a modern aviation miracle. Picture this. May 24th, 1988. A brand new Boeing 737 is cruising from Belize to New Orleans. On board are 45 people, including Captain Carlos Dardano. What makes Captain Dardano extraordinary isn't just his skill, but the fact that he's flying with only one eye. He lost his other eye to a stray bullet during the Civil War in El Salvador. This detail alone makes the story feel like a movie plot, but it's all true. The flight was routine until they began their descent into New Orleans. The weather on their radar looked manageable, just some typical rain showers. But as they flew into the clouds, the reality was terrifyingly different. The sky turned an ominous greenish yellow. Suddenly, the plane was pounded by rain so intense it was like flying through a waterfall. Then came the hail, not small pellets but ice chunks the size of golf balls, hammering the fuselage with deafening force. The cockpit windshield cracked, looking like a giant spider web, and the pilots could barely see. Inside the cabin, passengers were jolted awake. The deafening noise of the hail was terrifying. But the real nightmare was just beginning. The pilots watched in horror as the instruments showed both engines were failing. The hail and water had overwhelmed them, causing them to flame out. First, engine number 1 died, then engine number 2. Imagine the silence. One moment, the roar of the jets. The next, an eerie quiet, broken only by the sound of the wind and the hail. The Boeing 737, a massive, sophisticated piece of machinery, was now a 50-ton glider. In the cockpit, alarms blared. The plane lost all its main electrical power. The lights went out, and the flight displays went dark. They were falling out of the sky at a terrifying rate. Captain Dardano and his first officer, Dionisio Lopez, were left with only a few basic backup instruments, powered by a small battery. They were flying blind in a violent storm, with no engines, dropping thousands of feet per minute. The air traffic controller in New Orleans could only watch their altitude plummet on his screen, helplessly asking TACA 110, "Are you okay?" There was no response. Captain Dardano remained unbelievably calm. He knew he had to try restarting the engines. This procedure, known as a windmill restart, uses the airflow from the plane's descent to spin the turbine blades, hopefully reigniting the engine. It's a desperate, last-ditch maneuver that's rarely successful, especially under these conditions. He kept his hand on the throttle, trying again and again to bring the engines back to life. As they dropped below 5,000 feet, a miracle happened. The first engine sputtered, then roared back to life. A few moments later, the second one followed. They had power, but the relief was short-lived. The engines were damaged, were making strange noises, and weren't providing full thrust. One of the engines was overheating dangerously. Dardano knew they couldn't rely on them for long. They'd escaped one crisis only to face another. They were still too low and too far to reach the international airport. Their only option was a smaller airfield, but even that was a stretch. As they broke through the clouds, the pilots saw the ground rushing up to meet them. They were over a swampy industrial area east of New Orleans. There was water everywhere. Dardano realized he couldn't make it to any runway, had to land the plane immediately, but where? All he could see were canals and wetlands. Then, First Officer Lopez spotted something. A wide, grassy strip of land next to a canal was a levee, a raised embankment built to prevent flooding. It wasn't a runway. It was uneven, wet earth. But it was long and straight. It was their only chance. Dardano made a split-second decision that would seal their fate. He told the control tower, "We're going to have to put it down on the levee." The controller was stunned. Landing a 737 on a patch of grass seemed impossible. Dardano lined up the aircraft. He had to fly it like a glider again, carefully managing his speed and altitude. It's too fast, and they'd overshoot. It's too slow, and they'd stall and crash. He was aiming for a narrow strip of land, with a canal on one side and a fence on the other. He had one shot to get this right. Remember, he was doing all of this with only one eye. His depth perception was limited, making this already impossible task even harder. Inside the cabin, the flight attendants had prepared the passengers for an emergency landing. People were bracing for impact, many fearing the worst. The plane glided silently towards the grassy levee. Dardano skillfully brought the aircraft down. The wheels touched the soft earth, digging into the mud. The plane bounced, skidded, and slid for what must have felt like an eternity. It sloshed through the wet grass, slowing down closer and closer to the end of the levee. Finally, with a lurch, the massive jet came to a complete stop. Silence. Then disbelief. They had made it. They had landed a bowing 737 on a narrow strip of grass, with no engines, in the middle of a storm. Not a single person was seriously injured. It was an absolute miracle. When the emergency crews arrived, they couldn't believe their eyes. A commercial airliner was sitting perfectly intact on a levee in the middle of nowhere, as if it had been gently placed there. The passengers evacuated safely, walking away from a situation that should have been fatal. The story of Taca Flight 110 became legendary in the aviation world. Captain Carlos Dardano's incredible skill, calmness under pressure, and courageous decision-making saved everyone on board. He didn't see himself as a hero. He said he was just doing his job. And what happened to the plane? Well, the story gets even more incredible. Bowing engineers came to the site, replaced the damaged engines right there on the levee, and a test pilot actually took off from that same grassy strip. The plane was flown to a repair facility, and it eventually returned to service, flying for years afterward. The incident led to important changes in pilot training for severe weather and engine design, making flying safer for everyone. The story of Taca 110 is a powerful reminder of the human element in aviation. It's about how training, teamwork, and sheer determination can overcome impossible odds. Captain Dardano is the one-eyed pilot who turned a powerless jet into a glider and landed it on a strip of grass, truly performed one of the greatest feats in aviation history. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this incredible story, be sure to like and subscribe for more. See you next time.